So, we have earlier looked into hyponatremia and hypernatremia. Today, we are going to look at the potassium metabolism disorders, practical approach to hypokalemia. We'll try to restrict it to practice orientation, and you can see the table of contents or the floor plan here. Overview, pathophysiology, etiological considerations, how do we evaluate the patient, and specific ECG changes of hypokalemia, and of course the treatment. Potassium changes are one of the common electrolyte disorders. If you rate it, hyponatremia is the very common one, then will be the hypokalemia. Of course, hypernatremia and hyperkalemia also can occur. Calcium disorders are also there. Basically, as far as the potassium disorders are concerned, we require to classify them into those related to decreased intake, those related to altered excretion, and those which are transcellular shifts. Okay. Diuretics and diarrhea are the commonest causes of hypokalemia. This is an overview I am giving. So, usually, if you are suspecting hypokalemia or if you have a report of hypokalemia, just see whether the patient is on diuretic and whether the renal failure, hyperglycemia, and drugs are the cause of hyperkalemia. For hypokalemia, D and D, diuretics and diarrhea. For other things, it is renal failure, hyperglycemia, medication-induced hyperkalemia. Okay. Severe changes of potassium can lead to conduction disturbance, cardiac conduction, and neuromuscular conduction. Okay. Now, what will be the way I diagnose them? Of course, very good history, physical exams, labs, and ECG will be a good tool here. You don't require CT scans, MRIs, and all that in most of the cases, because majority of them are easily sort of differentiated using these basic tests and criteria. Hypokalemia is treated usually with oral and if necessary only with IV potassium. And hyperkalemia, we need to treat with calcium, insulin with glucose, albuterol, and potassium binding resin, K-oxalate. So this is for the hyperkalemia. So this is an overview. I have given what is the summary of this particular slide. These are common disorders. Decreased intake, altered excretion, transcellular shifts are important for hypokalemia. For hypo, it is diuretic and diarrhea. And then the loss in the kidney, loss through the GI tract. For hyper, it is the renal, hyperglycemic medications, and hyperkalemia. Okay, these result in conduction disturbances of the nerves related to the heart and related to the neuromuscular system. The important way I diagnose them is by history, physical, labs, and ECG, not too many sophisticated tests. Okay. Now, what is the normal potassium range? Anywhere between 3.5 to 5 milliequivalents per liter. Because potassium is a single atom, and it's not like oxygen. There are no two atoms in the molecule. So the milliequivalent will be equivalent to the millimole. Even if you say 3.5 millimoles or milliequivalents, it will be the same. Because one molecule is one atom. So the equivalent weight is equivalent to the molecular weight. So hypokalemia is 3.5 milliequivalent. Some laboratories report as millimoles. You don't require any conversion because millimoles are equivalent to milliequivalents as far as sodium and potassium is concerned, because they are monoatomic and they are not having like 2 or 3 atoms in the molecule. You understand that? So if you see millimoles, don't get confused, same as milliequivalents. How frequent is that? 21% of the hospital patients and 2% of the outpatients. You know the prevalence of diabetes? Around 4% in the outpatient. 2% of the outpatient people are having hypokalemia. That means as a routine, you must be seeing electrolytes in all those patients, particularly elderly, those who are in renal disease, those who are treatment of hypertension, those who are ischemic heart disease, Those who are diabetics, they must get a routine electrolyte check. Now, we need to classify the disease as mild, moderate, and severe. 3.5 to 3 is mild. Anything more than 3.5 is normal. 3.5 to 3 is mild. 2 to 2.5 to 3 is moderate. Less than 2.5 is severe. Why this is required? Because severe hypokalemia, you would like to replenish the potassium much faster. Again, just like another disorders, the degree of the severity of the hypokalemia does not correlate with the clinical symptoms. Usually, even in hyponatremia also, patient may have severe symptoms, hyponatremia may not be very severe. Patient may have severe hyponatremia in the blood, but symptoms may not be there. Like that. So, we know that there are intracellular and extracellular. Is in the ECF, the major cation is sodium and major anion is chloride in the ECF. In the ICF, the major cation is potassium and the major anion is phosphate, okay, and protein. So we are interested in this because it is a maximum an intracellular cation. Normal cellular function, it requires the nerve and muscle function, requires the exchange of sodium and potassium at the cell membrane. Cell membrane depolarization, all of you know, movement of sodium into the cell and movement of potassium outside the cell is a depolarization. And that is required both in skeletal muscle, in the smooth muscle, in the cardiac syncytium, and for the nerve function. So much so, disorders like hypokalemia or hyperkalemia, they end up in conduction disturbances related to the nerves of the heart, of the skeletal muscles, of the smooth muscles, and of course the nervous system. So there is a typical pump is there to send exchange sodium and potassium. This is called sodium potassium ATPase. This ATPase is there in most of the cell membranes, most pronounced in the distal convoluted tubule and in the collecting ducts of the renal, this one. And of course, sodium potassium KATPase is required for the entry of sodium into and exit of the potassium outside the cell. So intracellular potassium is more and sodium is outside it is more. When potassium, sodium gets in, a molecule of potassium, an atom of potassium is exchanged for that, and this is an energy dependent process. It is not an electrochemical gradient or osmotic gradient or passive diffusion or anything. It is an ATPase dependent pump. This is called the sodium potassium ATPase pump. The obligatory renal loss per day is around 10 to 15 milliequivalents per day. 10 to 15 milliequivalents of potassium has to go through the kidney. This is called the obligate loss. If necessary, it can excrete more, but this is the minimum that will be excreted. Let us look at the physiological considerations. The daily intake will be around 1 milliequivalent per kilogram. Around 60 milliequivalents and maximum 100 milliequivalents will be the daily intake. What happens to the daily intake? Whatever is required is utilized, and 90% of it is excreted through the kidney and 10% through the gut. So the 90% of the renal excretion is handled by the kidney and 10% of potassium excretion is from the colon of the gut, specifically the colon of the gut. Homeostasis is through regulation of the renal excretion at the level of the collecting duct. So the switch there to increase or decrease the excretion of potassium is in the collecting duct and is under the influence of the mineralocorticoid aldosterone. Okay. Excretion increased by aldosterone and because sodium is reabsorbed, sodium is reabsorbed and potassium is sent out. That is the aldosterone is a salt conserving hormone. So sodium is conserved and potassium is excreted in the convoluted tubules. or whenever you present more load to the of sodium to the distal convoluted tubule by employing a diuretic, what will happen? More sodium is available in the distal convoluted tubule, so much so sodium potassium exchange occurs, some sodium is reabsorbed and potassium is excreted in its place, either by aldosterone or by excess presentation of sodium in the DCT, as happens with certain types of diuretics like hydrochlorothiazide and then the carbonic anhydrous inhibitor or the furosemide, and not spironolactones. They are the reverse action. High urine flow or osmotic diuresis as occurs in diabetes or mannitol or any solute overload will produce osmotic diuresis. And that also, when there is a high urine flow due to osmotic diuresis, potassium also is washed out. So now we have how many? One, aldosterone, where sodium is conserved and potassium is excreted. Two, when you use diuretics, where more sodium is presented to the collecting ducts, in exchange potassium is washed out. Whenever there is osmotic diuresis due to presence of osmotic substances like ketones or glucose or mannitol, whatever, or the serum potassium is high, body would like to excrete the excess potassium through the kidney. So these are the four renal mechanisms. Aldosterone conserves sodium, excretes potassium. More sodium by diuretics promotes more potassium loss, and osmotic diuresis produces potassium loss, and then high serum potassium, there will be loss of potassium in the urine. This is how the renal regulation. Another thing is, if there are more negatively charged anions in the collecting duct, HCO3 is an important, sort of substance in order to keep the acid-base balance. Body tries to absorb the HCO3. In exchange, potassium is sent out. Okay, so that is why HCO3, when there is more of HCO3, and this potassium combines with HCO3 to form potassium bicarbonate. That is excreted. Whenever there are negatively charged ions are presented, this is a positively charged ion, and there will be washout of some positively charged ions. So much so potassium also is washed out. Okay, potassium excretion is decreased by the opposite factors. Why that is important? When we look at hyperkalemia, because there will be less of aldosterone, there will be all the factors. In case of low potassium in the serum, or when there are less of bicarbonate in the urine, the potassium excretion is reversed in the opposite direction. Okay, in renal failure, gut excretion increases. In renal failure, kidney is not able to handle enough potassium. It's not able to excrete the potassium. Then, instead of 90% here, kidney and 10% in the gut, this becomes 60%, and that will be taken care of by the gut, 30 to 40%. So that is again a sort of a game playing. When the kidney is not able to handle, the gut handles the potassium. These are some of the physiological considerations. Some more is important for us. So there is a transcellular shift of potassium between ECF and ICF. Okay, let us draw the cell. Any cell for that matter. And this is the channel. And this is the movement into the cell and out of the cell. Okay. Okay, what are the factors which put the potassium into the cell? Insulin puts into the cell. Glucagon puts out of the cell. These are the glucoregulatory hormones. If you have insulin in the system, there will be potassium will be shunted into the cell, and in the absence of insulin, there will be hyperglycemia and the potassium is retained outside. Okay, now if the cell is there is glycemia everywhere, and this glycemia all over, and then the potassium moves out. In case of hyperglycemia, there will be high potassium. That is why when you treat DKA, what you give? You give insulin and glucagon. With this insulin, potassium moves into the cell. You don't require to do anything for the high potassium. Just give insulin drip, automatically the potassium settles. So the first factor, the glucoregulatory hormones are insulin into glucagon, go out. Insulin into glucagon, go out. Adrenergic hormones like alpha adrenergic, alpha out, and beta adrenergic substances, into beta into and alpha out. That is the second one. The third one is acidosis out of the cell. Acid out, alkali in. Okay. So now we know what are the three factors which send the potassium into the cell. Number one, insulin. Number two, beta agonist. Number three, alkalosis. What are the ones which send the potassium out of the cell? Glucagon, alpha agonist, and acidosis. Okay, these are the transcellular shifts. So we have seen one is excretion at the level of kidney that we discussed. The second one is excretion by the gut. And the third one is transmembranous, transcellular, NAK, ATPase dependent ECF, ICF transports. And these are dependent on various factors, basically on the three things. Insulin in, glucagon out of the cell, potassium. Alpha receptor stimulants, alpha adrenergic stimulants out of the cell, beta into the cell. Acidosis of the milieu, acidotic milieu out of the cell, alkalosis into the cell. Suppose you have alpha blockers, they will be acting like beta. Beta blockers, they will be acting like alpha. So we commonly use beta blockers, we commonly use alpha blockers, we commonly use beta stimulants. So that is why we require to know that these are the changes that can occur. So I have covered the physiology in a quite sumptuous way for you to understand what are the etiology. Now come back to this. This is a very central diagram. If you understand this, you will be able to understand. Okay. Now, GI tract, we know that is one area where the potassium is handled. Kidney is the other area it is handled. Okay. And third one is the transmembrane shifts. I told you. The etiology, this is an etiological diagram, a pathophysiological diagram pointing you to the etiology of this one. The color coded, all those are purple are electrolytes, all those are cream colored are hormones, all the green ones are the physiological effects. So there is an intake here and there is an excretion here. So it could be due to decreased intake or increased excretion can lead to hypokalemia. Hypokalemia, there is decreased oral peroral intake of potassium or due to diarrhea or vomiting. There is excretion through the GI tract, more of potassium is excreted. So that is one etiological mechanism through the GI tract mechanism, intake and excretion. The second one is kidney. Okay, there is already. Okay. Here, there is more amount of potassium is thrown out in the urine. We have already seen the reasons. Aldosterone, more of diuretics, and more of bicarbonate, more of solutes, osmotic diuresis. All of these can increase the renal excretion of potassium. Okay. Now, you know the angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2 that we get into the next slide. But this angiotensin 2 is a powerful vasopressor, and also it favorably keeps the and the action of that, it retains the sodium. Angiotensin 2 is a potent vasopressor and it retains the sodium. The opposite of that is done by the ANP and the BNP. They're just opposite. They try to keep the sodium away. Whatever keeps the sodium into the blood pushes the potassium out. Okay. Here, aldosterone has got a positive effect, angiotensin has got a positive effect on the sodium, and they have got a negative effect on the potassium. Aldosterone, angiotensin has got a positive effect on the water, and then water is retained and sodium is retained. That is how the combination of these mechanisms, ANP, BNP on one hand, angiotensin and aldosterone on the other hand, try to maintain the balance between sodium, potassium, and water. The net result is any disturbance in the angiotensin 1 aldosterone, let us say there is excess aldosterone, there is excess angiotensin, sodium is retained, potassium is lost. Likewise, excess ADH also retains water and retains sodium and loses the potassium. This is the second mechanism. What is the third one? Transcellular. I said insulin in and glucagon out. Catecholamines beta, beta in, alpha out. And then alkalosis in, acidosis out. So these are the three types of etiological, etiopathogenic slide. This is a slide which shows the etiopathogenesis of hypokalemia. Let us write it down on a tabular form. So the mechanisms are GI, poor intake, GI losses. Together, these are GI. This is renal losses and internal redistribution of transcellular potassium problems. Okay, what are the poor intake? Starvation, anorexia, tea toast life means they don't have anything to eat except a cup of tea and a toasted bun or bread. These are very poor people. They don't have access to fruits and rich foods which contain a lot of potassium. So they will end up in time in hypokalemia. This is called tea toast, is a typical sort of expression of poverty. He is a tea toast man, means that he is a poor man. He doesn't have anything else to eat. So bulimia and eating disorder, certain types of pica also will interfere with potassium absorption that is taken in, and total parenteral nutrition. Supposing a patient is total parenteral nutrition and you are not taking care to supplement potassium also, patient will go into hypokalemia. So what are the poor intake? Starvation, anorexia, tea toast life, bulimia, pica, total parenteral nutrition. GI losses can occur due to vomiting, due to nasogastric drainage, due to diarrhea. Very common cause is diarrhea, laxative abuse. Certain people, they wanted to have very free motion. They will be, they're not happy with one stools. They will be using more laxatives like your Creamafin or your Dufalac or whatever. Laxative abuse is quite common, particularly in the elderly. Ureterosigmoidostomy. Suppose there is a bladder cancer. What will happen? The bladder obstruction will be there. To overcome that, the ureters are implanted. A segment of the colon is isolated and ureters are implanted into that. And what will happen? These ureters bring in urine with sodium, and then what will happen? And this fluid in this here is a lot rich in sodium. The sodium is brought into the body. In exchange, potassium is sent into that sigmoid loop and potassium is excreted. It is like diarrhea only. Here, there is no diarrhea, but then the sodium is pushed in and an exchange potassium is pushed out of the body. Ureterosigmoidostomy is one of the very important causes of loss of potassium. Okay, vomiting, nasogastric drainage, diarrhea, laxative abuse, ureterosigmoidostomy. Now you know how important is the history to pinpoint the cause of hypokalemia. This is a history, this is a history, this is a history, this is a history, and here is a patient with ureterosigmoidostomy. This is a history, this is a history, this is a history, this is a history, this is also a history, everything. All these are from the history itself. You can say that hypokalemia is the cause. Okay. How about urinary losses? We know hydrochlorothiazide and then chlorthalidone and loop diuretics. Chlorthalidone, hydrochlorthalidone, is more notorious compared to chlorothiazide. You may be using them for your heart failure or hypertension, and you will be using your furosemide and other loop diuretics. Okay, remember, never try to combine hydrochlorothiazide with loop diuretic because both are sodium wasting, both present lot of sodium to the distal tubule. With the result, there is loss of potassium. Okay, diuretic used, you have to use either loop or hydrochlorothiazide, preferably not chlorothalidone. So this is again a history. Okay. Menorlocorticoid excess. This will require some investigations. We will see in the next slide. And also this is a typical renal tubular acidosis. We have already discussed at length on this topic. Type 1, type 2, type 4 and all that. Type 1 and type 2 are associated with, as we have seen there, are associated with potassium loss. Of course, not type 4, which is called hyperkalemic renal tubular acidosis. The name itself is hyperkalemic and not hypokalemic. Okay, salt wasting nephropathy, we haven't looked at this in hyponatremia. Then lot of salt is presented again to the distal tubule. Salt here is sodium, and so much so potassium is exchanged and lost. There are certain drugs which can cause certain genetic diseases also, which can cause urinary losses. We will see in separate slide. Another important thing is hypomagnesemia is an underlying factor for hypokalemia. So if you just replace the magnesium, the potassium gets corrected. So never forget to look at the magnesium whenever there is hypokalemia. And polyuria, compulsive polyuria, polydipsia, diabetes insipidus, these are also causes where excess urine is produced, and during the excess urination, there will be also loss of electrolytes. Potassium may be lost. These are the urinary losses. How about internal redistribution, or we have seen the transmembrane exchange of sodium and potassium? We know insulin pushes the potassium into the cell. Catecholamines push that. Alkalosis also pushes into the cell. The opposite way, glucagon, beta alpha receptor stimulants and acidosis. And in conditions where you have marked cellular turnover. What is marked cellular turnover? Marked cellular turnover occurs in leukemias, in wherever there are tumors, particularly AML, acute myeloid leukemia. And the cell turnover itself generates a situation where more of the potassium is used up for formation of the cells, because that being the intracellular dominant cation, whenever there are more cells are produced and they require more potassium, so potassium requirement goes up, there will be hypokalemia. Osmotic diuresis presenting osmotic substances into the kidney, into the distal tubule, like hyperglycemia, ketones, hypertonic mannitol, all those things can produce internal redistribution, not at the kidney level, but at the cellular level also. There is another entity, specific entity called hypokalemic periodic paralysis. This periodic paralysis, the patient in between the paralytic attacks is very normal. That's why it's called periodic. It is precipitated by sympathetic amine usage, or when you are using, it is after food and it is after exercise. So typically the patient complains, I had exercise and a hypokalemia. I had food, hypokalemia. I had sympathetic amines and hypokalemia. So this is a hypokalemic periodic paralysis. So these are the etiological mechanisms of causation further elucidated as we have looked at in the slide: GI, urinary, and distribution between the cell membrane, ECF and the ICF. Internal redistribution between ECF to ICF. Intracellular fluid to extracellular fluid to intracellular fluid. Okay, let us look at a little bit about the renin-angiotensin aldosterone axis. So there is a renin there is a decrease in the renal perfusion pressure, automatically the juxtaglomerular apparatus secretes a substance called renin. This renin is an enzyme which catalyzes the formation of a protein called angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. And that catalysis is done by the renin. Angiotensinogen is produced in the liver. This angiotensinogen is converted into angiotensin 1, and this angiotensin 1 is acted upon by an enzyme, angiotensin converting enzyme, which is predominantly in the lung, and so that conversion occurs in the lung and it becomes angiotensin 2. All of you know this is the most vasoactive molecule. And not only it produces hypertension, it acts on the steroid precursors in the adrenal cortex and produces aldosterone, which retains sodium and then which conserves sodium and excretes potassium. Okay, this is physiological, these are enzymes, these are hormones. So now, supposing we have hyperkalemia and a patient of hypertension, hypokalemia and patient of hypotension, hypertension and hypokalemia, and we can use ACE inhibitors or beta, the beta blockers conveniently to see that the hypokalemia is corrected. This is one important mechanism there. Now, let us see what are the, we have left this there. We just wanted to discuss this part later on. For that, this diagram has come, and that's what we are discussing. Mineralocorticoid excess. How can it be? It could be primary hyperaldosteronism. Primarily, the adrenal gland, adrenal cortex is producing more aldosterone, or secondary hyperaldosteronism due to renal gland is not at fault, but more renin is produced, more that is causing hyperaldosteronism. In primary, what happens? It is the adrenal gland itself producing usually an adenoma, not a carcinoma. Usually an adenoma of the adrenal secreting adenoma of the adrenal gland or CAH, congenital adrenal hyperplasia in children. This results in primary hyperaldosteronism. The two commonest causes of primary hyperaldosteronism, adrenal secreting adenoma or congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Commonest causes. Secondary hyperaldosteronism, renovascular disease, renal artery stenosis, renal atherosclerotic arterial disease, renin secreting tumors. These are the ones which produce hyperaldosteronism, secondary hyperaldosteronism. And the third category is pseudo hyperaldosteronism. What is pseudo hyperaldosteronism? There is no excess of aldosterone, but a hormone which has got some action, or like aldosterone-like action, like the steroid hormone. There, the Cushing syndrome can occur, or exogenous mineralocorticoid usage. These are the pseudo hyperaldosteronism. Okay, how do I differentiate them? Look at the renin, look at the aldosterone in the blood. In case of primary hyperaldosteronism, aldosterone of course will be very high and renin will be suppressed. That's like a biofeedback inhibition, low or normal renin. In secondary hyperaldosteronism, the problem is more high renin, so more aldosterone, both will be high. Whereas in pseudo-hyperaldosteronism, the excess the hormone from outside suppresses both renin and aldosterone. This is the easier way of differentiating primary hyperaldosteronism from secondary hyperaldosteronism to pseudo-hyperaldosteronism. Do a renin low, aldosterone high, primary hyperaldosteronism. Renin high, aldosterone low, secondary hyperaldosteronism. Both high, secondary hyperaldosteronism. Both low are normal, and still there is aldosteronism features. It could be Cushing's or exogenous mineralocorticoids. So now I have exhausted all the etiologies like poor intake, GI losses, urinary losses, mineralocorticoids, and I did not get into renal tubular acidosis because you already had that lecture. Remember, type 1 and type 2 are associated with low potassium, and type 4 is associated with high potassium. That's good enough. What are the drugs that can cause? Diuretics, particularly chlorthalidone, hydrochlorothiazide, diuretics, carbonic anhydrase inhibitor, this more than the hydrochlorothiazide. So chlorthalidone is worse in terms of hypokalemia compared to hydrochlorothiazide, which is worse than the loop diuretic. Never try to combine them. Methylxanthines, theophylline, and caffeine, they can produce hypokalemia, excessive coffee drinkers, possibility of hypokalemia. Verapamil overdose can have hypokalemia. Antibiotics like penicillin, particularly large quantities of penicillin G, ampicillin, carbenicillin, or aminoglycosides like gentamicin, anti-cancer drugs like cisplatin can produce. Bicarbonate itself can produce hypocalcemia, and this is a drug which is now being used very much for the reason of mucormycosis. Amphotericin B is notorious to cause hypokalemia. Ephedrine and ephedra alkaloids also do produce. Beta agonist intoxication. We know beta agonists send the potassium into the cell. So that is why beta agonist, overuse of beta agonist can produce hypokalemia. This is how you look at the drugs. And now you have the genetic disorders, which are rarer causes of hypokalemia. That's why this is kept a little to the end. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia, we see how it works in the previous slide. Glucocorticoid remediable hypertension, Bartter syndrome, Gettleman syndrome, Riddle syndrome, Gallner syndrome, thyrotoxic periodic paralysis. They have periodic paralysis, just like hypokalemic periodic paralysis. But the primary reason there is hyperthyroidism. That's why we need to do the adrenal function and thyroid function also in these cases. Now there is one syndrome called the SISAM syndrome, which has got seizure, sensorineural deafness, ataxia, mental retardation, and electrolyte impairment. SC, seizure, S for sensorineural, A for ataxia, M for mental, and then E for electrolyte imbalance. SISAM syndrome is a rare disorder of hypokalemia. Now, I have thoroughly given you the picture of what are all the things which can cause. So now just summarize them. Medications, we know diuretics, laxatives, enema, steroids, GI losses, renal losses, osmotic, mineralocorticoid excess, type 1 and type 2 renal tubular acidosis, transcellular shifts like alkalosis, and then increased beta adrenergic stimulation, delirium tremens due to alcohol, head injury, and then myocardial ischemia, thyrotoxicosis also we considered, and we also considered hypomagnesemia, we considered dialysis and plasmapheresis can also occur, transcellular shift, insulin, beta-2 stimulants, decongestants, xanthines, amphotericin, verapamil intoxication, chloroquine also is known to cause beryllium intoxication. Here anorexia, dementia, starvation, TPN, everything is there. There is one thing which we did not talk about is the pseudo-hypokalemia. What is that? If you keep the sample for a while and analyze it after 4 or 5 hours in the refrigerator, the potassium is depleted because the cells absorb the potassium, and that is a pseudo-hypokalemia. How do I overcome that? Immediately analyze the blood. Potassium and sodium, we should not wait and do after a few hours because there will be changes there. Another thing is, if there is a significant leukocytosis to the tune of 75,000 as occurs in some of the leukemioid reactions and leukemias, then that can lead to pseudo-hypokalemia. That's why AML and then the storage issues are listed there. So this exhausts the list of causes. Instead of writing these like these lists, it is better for you to understand in the way which we have presented, like, the drugs, genetic disorders, and this table, and then based on this particular diagram would be better way of remembering rather than asking you to list all the things like this as has been done in one of the books. Okay. Now, how do I evaluate clinical manifestations of hypokalemia? No symptoms and signs until it is less than 3 milliequivalents. So signs and symptoms are 2 major organs, particularly the muscle, skeletal as well as smooth muscle, and cardiac conduction. What happens? Weakness. Legs more than the arms. Cramps, patient will complain. Smooth muscle paralysis with ileus of the bowel, rhabdomyolysis in very severe cases. Decreased tendon reflexes. This is the deep tendon reflexes or depressed respiratory muscle paralysis in severe cases. It might be confused with other respiratory muscle paralysis causes like Guillain-Barré and other. So muscle weakness. This is again, skeletal muscle as well as the smooth muscle. Both are affected. Conduction defects, ECG changes, we will see separately. Clinical manifestations are non-specific and very challenging because weakness, cramps, these things do occur in many conditions. It's very difficult unless you have suspicion. Need to have high index of suspicion for electrolyte disorders, particularly hypokalemia. Now, what are the stepwise diagnostic evaluation? First step, most etiologies are evident in the history itself. A careful history will tell you this is the cause of the hypokalemia. Magnesium, you have to check, and that immediately corrects if it is low. And measure the acid-base status and urinary potassium. Relate the urine potassium to urine creatinine. That is called urine potassium by urine creatinine ratio UK by UCR. UK is urine potassium, UCR is urine creatinine. So that you have to work out. Now, so how do I interpret the results of urine potassium? So urine potassium, UK is to UCR, that is the potassium in the plasma in the urine compared to creatinine in the urine, that you take it. Less than 13 milliequivalents or more than 13 milliequivalents. Means what? If it is more than 13 milliequivalents, kidney is wasting the potassium. Kidney is the culprit. If it is less than 13 milliequivalents of potassium per gram of creatinine, then it is extrarenal is the cause. This immediately separates extrarenal causes like diarrhea, laxative abuse, vomiting, and laxative abuse in minority of cases. Majority. How do I differentiate them? Look at the metabolic status, acid status. Acidosis, diarrhea. Alkalosis, vomit. Okay, metabolic acidosis, urine creatinine, urine potassium creatinine ratio less than 13, wasting is outside the kidney, diarrhea is the answer if there is metabolic acidosis. If there is alkalosis, vomiting is the answer. Laxative abuse, mostly it is acidosis, rarely it is alkalosis. Supposing potassium creatinine ratio in the urine is more than 13, means kidney is wasting. How can it waste? Renal tubular acidosis, type 1 and 2, or diabetic ketoacidosis, osmotic diuresis, and renal wasting is more. Or in these cases, it will be acidosis. If the patient is alkalotic, I am with mineralocorticoid excess and salt wasting nephropathy. This is how you differentiate between the renal wastings by looking at urine potassium compared to urine creatinine, and if that is expressed in milliequivalents per kilogram, milliequivalents per milliequivalents of potassium per gram of creatinine, that is the value. If you use millimoles, 1.5 milliequivalents per millimole of creatinine. So if the numerator is millimole there, then you have the cutoff value is 1.5. If both are in the milliequivalents, then it is 13. Usually creatinine is expressed in millimoles. That is why I have given you this number also. Okay. Now what do? I take a ratio of urine potassium and urine creatinine. Measure in milliequivalents, both of them. If it is 13 or less, it is diarrhea, vomiting. How do I differentiate? Acidosis, diarrhea, alkalosis, vomiting. Laxative abuse, history is available. Whereas if the urine creatinine ratio is more than 13, kidney is the culprit. It is wasting the potassium. And if there is acidosis, it is diabetic ketoacidosis or renal tubular acidosis. Both are acidotic conditions. Whereas if there is a metabolic alkalosis, mineralocorticoid excess or salt wasting nephropathy. You need to know one more concept called the transtubular potassium gradient. What is this transtubular potassium gradient? Take spot urine, not 24-hour urine, and obtain the urine potassium and plasma osmolality. This is serum potassium, urine osmolality. It is nothing but urine potassium by urine osmolality divided by serum potassium by serum osmolality. If that divided by symbol, if you want to convert into multiplication symbol, this will go up and this will go down. That is what is called the TTKG, transtubular potassium gradient. Instead of relating to the creatinine, transtubular potassium gradient, this is nothing but we are relating the urine potassium to plasma osmolality and urine osmolality. So what you do is you measure the urine potassium, you measure the serum potassium, you measure the plasma osmolality and urine osmolality. Urine potassium by urine osmolality divided by serum potassium by serum osmolality. And if you cross multiply them, this is what you get. So what is the end result? Is it less than 3? If it is less than 3, during hypokalemia, we expect the kidney not to excrete much of potassium. If it is like that, then there is no problem. Urine excretion of potassium is appropriately reduced. But if the potassium excretion continues to be more, in spite of there being low potassium in the body, it indicates the renal loss is due to increase the distal potassium secretion. That means again to pin down the distal secretion of potassium is not bothered about what is happening in the body, and on its own it is secreting more potassium into the lumen. Okay. Now, what are the ECG changes? Here, T is the 10th house of potassium. Means what? If the T is more, the 10th will be bigger. If the T is less, the 10th will be flatter and maybe even inverted. T is the 10th house of potassium. Hyperkalemia, hyperacute T waves, hypokalemia, flat or inverted T waves. What are the things that happen? ST depression, T inversion, U wave, and QT prolongation. Okay. Now, these are the 4 different changes. Now, just look here. This is slightly prolonged PR interval, slightly peaked P wave, and then shallow, very T wave is rather coming down, and ST depression you can see, and appearance of U wave. After the T wave, there is another positive wave, and that is not normally seen in the ECG. So that is the thing. So ST depression, as you can see here, T inversion, that also is seen. U wave, you can see here. And this QT prolongation I put query because QT interval is measured from here to the end of the T wave. But when the T wave is not properly visible, you measure up to here. Actually, that is called the QU interval. And you are measuring QU and thinking it is prolonged QT interval. It is a pseudo prolongation of the QT interval. So you have to be very aware of the QT prolongation syndromes there in hypokalemia, and it is not the true QT prolongation. Sometimes when you use drugs which prolong the QT interval, then if the hypokalemia is there, that can end up in dangerous arrhythmias. That is why we have to find out true QT interval or pseudo QT interval prolongation. So this is again another real-time ECG. That is the diagram there. This is a real-time ECG where you can see ST depression, T inversion, and U wave there. This is the U wave there. And this is the T wave depressed and ST depression. And when you want to look at the QT interval, you start from here and then go up to here, which is not correct. You are including the U wave there. And that is why you have to be careful. Abnormalities of hypokalemia are dangerous. QT prolonging drugs if you use, and there is digoxin also used, toxicity is precipitated, acute coronary syndromes also add on to the problem. If there is associated hypokalemia, hypomagnesemia is unrecognized underlying feature. If treated, it saves the life, and ventricular tachycardia and torsades de pontis. What is torsades de pontis? You have the birthday ribbons. birthday ribbon, it will be like that, and then narrows, and again it comes, and again there will be narrow part like that, isn't it? So ECG looks like a birthday ribbon, but that means there will be very low voltage ventricular complexes followed by very high voltage complexes, low voltage, high voltage. It is an impending ECG of ventricular fibrillation and death. Torsades de Pointes is a precursor or forerunner of ventricular fibrillation. You have to be very careful. And this is one of the important features that can occur. Is usually less than 2 milliequivalents of potassium. Immediately you need to correct. So how do I treat? Quickly. Urgency depends upon the rate of development. If it is acute, you need to treat urgently. If it is slowly or subacute, you can slowly treat. Presence of high-risk features like associated acute coronary syndrome or QT prolonged due to drugs or any other conditions or arrhythmia already there, then you have to treat quickly. Treatment to correct the etiology and replace. Number one, what is the etiology? Laxative abuse, stop. Parenteral nutrition, look into that. And anorexia, see some feeding is given. And that is exactly, supplementation. That is correcting the etiology. Diuretic use, stop the diuretic and replace the potassium. Too important. There is no need to correct to 4 milliequivalents unless there is an underlying acute coronary syndrome or Torsades de Pointes or VTAC. It is enough if you correct to 3.5. Majority of the people try to overcorrect it to 4. That can immediately swing the other way around and go for hyperkalemia, which could be again more dangerous than hypokalemia. So try to keep around 3.5. Now, reduce the potassium loss. Wherever, if it is diarrhea, treat the diarrhea, vomiting, replace the fluid and stop vomiting, replenishing the potassium in the stores, evaluation of potential toxicities, determination of the cause to prevent future episodes. These are the general principles. So prevent the losses, replenish the stores, look at the potential toxicities, and also how to prevent the recurrent episodes by looking at the etiology and taking care of the etiology. Now, what is the replacement I use? I use potassium chloride. Oral potassium chloride, IV potassium chloride. 15 ml of potassium chloride is equivalent to 20 milliequivalents. And here 10 ml is equivalent to 20 milliequivalents IV solution. But the rate at which we give differs. Here, most patients who can take oral medicines, oral potassium chloride is the indication. Suppose the patient is nil per oral, then you cannot give oral potassium, then IV potassium you have to give. How much I give? 40 milliequivalents at a time over a period of 4 hours if you require rapidly in 2 hours. That means roughly around 10 milliequivalents per hour or 7.5 ml per hour you have to use, not more than that. For 20 milliequivalents is 15 ml, that is 30 ml of oral potassium chloride to be given over a period of 4 hours, not pushing it quickly. Major problem is GI upset. Potassium salts in such a concentration of 20 milliequivalents in 15 ml will be GI upset can occur. Supposing you want to use IV potassium chloride, if the potassium is less than 2.5 or if there are other disorders like acute coronary syndrome or QT prolongation or tachycardias, then you have to use IV potassium chloride solution. 10 ml ampules are available. 10 ml, 10 milliequivalents via a peripheral vein. If you use a peripheral vein, you cannot push more than 10 milliequivalents per hour. Or that means 5 ml per hour. 5 ml. 10 ml is 20 milliequivalents. 10 milliequivalents is 5 ml of the IV solution over a period of 1 hour. As slow you have to give. If it is a central line, you can give up to 20 milliequivalents or 10 ml per hour. The problem, severe burning pain proximal to the IV site. So generally 90% of the cases, they can be treated with oral. Only 10% we require. Serum potassium concentration usually drops approximately 0.3 milliequivalents per liter for every 100 milliequivalents in the total body. If there is a total body potassium reduction of 100 and you get into 0.3 milliequivalents. So if somebody has got 3.8, 2.9 and you want to put him to 3.9, that means roughly around 0.9 roughly corresponds to 300 milliequivalents reduction. Because for every 100 milliequivalents, 0.3, here 900 here the difference is 0.9 milliequivalents. That means equivalent to 300 milliequivalents reduction. This is how you calculate what is the total loss in the body and how much you replace, whether you use oral or parenteral. Oral is preferable given at the rate of 40 milliequivalents or 30 ml in a matter of 4 hours. Problem TI upset. If I use IV, only in case of nil paraoral, I have to use it, or when there is severe indication to treat immediately. Then I use IV potassium chloride. In that case, I have to use peripheral vein 10 milliequivalents or 5 ml per hour. Here, 20 milliequivalents 10 ml per hour in the central vein. Burning pain is the problem. Now, let us see. Now, serum. So, if the serum potassium is 3.5, you can say the deficit is around that much. If it is less than 2, this is the amount of deficit. Roughly, for a 70 kilogram man, the amount of deficit can be roughly equated based on the reference in this particular journal article. So depending on that, you can roughly estimate what will be the difference or deficit and plan to replace that. And you will be using several solutions in your day-to-day practice. Isolate M, isolate P, G, E, RL. They are not equal. Don't just go on substituting one for the other. The potassium content in isolate M is maximum, it's minimum in Ringer lactate. Isolate P, 20 per liter, 17 per liter, 10 per liter in isolate E. If you want more potassium to go, use isolate M. If the potassium is normal in the serum, then you use isolate Ringer lactate. It's not an isolate M, isolate A, but it's not called iso-RL, simply called RL. Okay. So hypokalemia is safer than hyperkalemia. That is why don't be too vigorous to push the potassium to the other extreme. I gave you certain common IV fluids and their potassium content for your practical guidance. So what are some potassium rich foods? Fruit juices, tender coconut, banana, juicy and citrus fruits, dry fruits, chocolates, coffee, soups, and low sodium salt substitutes, where sodium content will be less, it is a potassium salt there. These are the potassium rich foods. Then I will just go through quickly the algorithm because I have to stop somewhere here. 3.6 or less or 3.5, check magnesium, replace immediately, first step. Then are the warning signs present? Yes, there is urgent therapy. And then, so you have, that is probably evidence of transcellular shift. If there is no warning signs, is it pseudohypokalemia? That means you don't require to do anything. If it is not pseudohypokalemia and the warning signs are absent, then evidence of decreased intake, is there a decreased intake or transcellular shift? You look at it. If such an evidence is there or not there, go to the next slide. If it is not there, then urinary potassium creatinine ratio, or if it is there, then there is an evidence of, treat the etiology of transcellular shift, like mineralocorticoids, or like, the diabetic ketoacidosis, whatever may be your cause of the transcellular shift, or use of beta adrenergic substances, or insulin, all those things are. Suppose urine creatinine and potassium ratio is less than 1.5 in millimoles or less than 13 if you express per gram, then that means the kidney is not the culprit and he is losing from somewhere. Extrarenal losses, gastrointestinal, inadequate intake, or diuretic use, or transcellular, or there is a diarrhea and vomiting. If the excretion is more, that means kidney is the cause and kidney is the culprit. Then is the blood pressure elevated and there hypervolemia? Yes, means I am dealing with mineralocorticoid excess, primary, secondary hyperaldosteronism, renal artery stenosis, Cushing syndrome, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where not only the potassium is low, there is extra blood pressure and hypervolemia is there. And these people usually have alkalosis. Whereas now check the acid-base status now. There is no extra blood pressure, normal blood pressure and volume is not elevated, then check the acid-base status. If there is acidosis, type 1 or type 2 renal tubular acidosis. And if it is alkalosis, then you are with emesis and diuretic use or Bartter syndrome or Gettleman syndrome. If it is variable, usually in hypomagnesemia. And we started with the symptoms of hypokalemia. Are there warning signs of hypokalemia? What are the warning signs? Symptoms of electrocardiographic changes of severe hypokalemia, rapid onset hypokalemia, or underlying heart disease.